Chosen ones. There's a pattern you may have noticed, but never fully put into words. At certain moments, usually when you're trying to focus, improve, or move forward, you feel a sudden surge of desire. It doesn't always feel connected to anything specific. It shows up in quiet moments, in transitions, sometimes right when you're gaining clarity. And the confusing part is it feels powerful. Not just physical, but mental. It pulls your attention, reshapes your mood, and sometimes even changes your decisions. So you start wondering, why does this keep happening? Not in a dramatic or mystical way, just in a real, grounded way. Because when something repeats itself at key moments in your life, it usually isn't random. It's connected to something deeper inside your psychology, your habits, and the way your mind processes growth. And once you begin to understand it, it stops feeling like something that controls you and starts becoming something you can actually work with. You're not the only one who has felt this. There are phases in life where you feel like you're evolving, thinking differently, seeing people differently, even questioning things you used to accept without thinking. And during those phases, your internal world becomes more intense. You might feel more isolated, not because you're completely alone, but because your perspective has shifted. Conversations don't hit the same. Distractions don't satisfy you the same way. Even your own habits start to feel out of alignment. And in the middle of that shift, desire becomes louder. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your system is trying to process change. The energy behind desire. Desire is often misunderstood as something purely physical. But if you pay attention closely, you'll notice it carries energy. Mental, emotional, even creative energy. It's the same force that can drive ambition, focus, attraction, connection, and sometimes even frustration. When you're not directing that energy consciously, it looks for the easiest outlet. That's why it can feel overwhelming. It's not just about attraction or impulse. It's about unused energy searching for expression. And when you're in a phase of growth, that energy tends to increase. Because you're changing internally. Your brain is forming new patterns, your awareness is expanding, and your old habits are slowly losing their grip. That transition creates tension. And desire becomes one of the ways that tension shows up. When growth feels like pressure, there's a stage in personal development that doesn't get talked about enough. It's the stage where you're no longer comfortable with your old self, but you haven't fully stepped into your new one either. You're in between, and that in-between phase creates pressure. You might feel restless without knowing why. You might start things but struggle to stay consistent. You might feel motivated one day and distracted the next. And in those moments, desire often becomes stronger. Not because it's trying to pull you backward, but because your system is overloaded. It's like your mind is holding too much at once. New awareness, old habits, uncertainty, expectation. So it looks for release. And desire becomes the quickest path. The loop most people never notice. Here's something subtle but important. The more you try to fight something aggressively, the more attention you give it. And attention strengthens patterns. So when someone constantly labels their own desires as a problem, something to suppress or eliminate completely, it often creates a loop. Awareness turns into tension. Tension turns into resistance. Resistance turns into fixation. And suddenly, the thing you're trying to control feels even stronger. Not because it actually is stronger, but because your relationship with it has become strained. A lot of people stay stuck in that loop for years, not realizing that the goal isn't extreme control. It's understanding. Because once you understand a pattern, you stop reacting to it blindly. Rewiring the meaning. At some point, you begin to see that desire isn't just about the surface-level feeling. It's tied to meaning. How you interpret it, If you see it as weakness, it drains you. If you see it as something to escape into, it controls you. But if you begin to see it as a signal, it changes everything. A signal that your energy needs direction. A signal that your mind is looking for engagement. A signal that something inside you is asking for expression. And once you start interpreting it differently, your response starts to change. You don't panic. You don't suppress. You observe. And observation creates space. That space is where control actually begins, redirecting without forcing. One of the biggest mistakes people make is trying to replace one habit with another instantly. But your mind doesn't work like a switch. It works like a system. So instead of forcing yourself to stop, the more effective approach is to redirect gradually. Not in a dramatic way, in a practical way. When you feel that surge of energy, instead of immediately reacting, you pause. Even for a few seconds. You let the feeling exist without acting on it right away. That small pause starts to weaken automatic patterns. And over time, you begin to notice something interesting. The intensity passes faster. The urge loses its grip. Not because you eliminated it, but because you stopped feeding it instantly. The shift into awareness. There's a moment that happens quietly. You don't notice it at first. But one day, you realize you're not reacting the same way anymore. The things that used to pull you instantly now give you a moment of choice. And that moment is everything. Because that's where awareness lives. Not in perfection, not in complete control, but in the ability to choose your response. And once you reach that point, the dynamic changes. You're no longer being dragged by patterns. You're observing them as they happen. Identity and internal alignment. At a deeper level, this isn't just about managing desire. It's about who you're becoming. Because every repeated action, every response, every moment of awareness builds your identity. Not the version of you that people see on the outside. The version of you that you experience internally. And when your internal actions start aligning with your intentions, something shifts. You feel more stable, more clear, more in control of your direction. Not because everything is perfect, but because you trust yourself more. And that trust changes how you move through life. Growth without extremes. There's a tendency to think growth has to be intense. All or nothing. Complete discipline or complete chaos. But real growth is usually quieter than that. It's consistent awareness. Small adjustments. Moments where you choose differently than you used to. And over time, those small moments build something solid. You don't have to eliminate parts of yourself to grow. You just have to understand them. Because what you understand, you can work with. And what you work with, you can shape. The long-term perspective. When you zoom out and look at your life over years instead of days, things become clearer. Patterns that felt overwhelming start to look manageable. Moments that felt confusing start to make sense. And you begin to see that everything you experience, every urge, every distraction, every moment of awareness, is part of a larger process. Not something to fear. Something to learn from. Something to refine. Because growth isn't about removing challenges. It's about becoming the kind of person who understands them. And maybe that's the real shift. Not asking, why is this happening to me? But asking, what is this showing me about myself? Because when you start asking better questions, your perspective changes. And when your perspective changes, your experience changes. If any part of this felt familiar, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, personal way, take a moment and reflect on it. You don't need to rush to fix anything. Sometimes, just understanding what's happening beneath the surface is enough to start moving differently. And if you've noticed patterns like this in your own life, it would be interesting to hear how you've experienced them and what helped you see them more moment you stop running from it. There's a subtle turning point that doesn't feel dramatic when it happens. You don't wake up completely different. You don't suddenly feel perfect. There's no instant transformation. Instead, something quieter shifts. You stop reacting to every urge like it's an emergency. You begin to sit with it even briefly. You notice how it rises, how it peaks, and how, if you don't immediately feed it, it starts to fade on its own. And that realization changes your relationship with yourself. Because for a long time, it might have felt like these impulses had control over you, like they showed up and you had no choice but to follow. But now, even if it's just for a few seconds, you see the gap. And that gap is where your power starts growing. The hidden link between focus and desire. Pay attention to when your urges become strongest. It's not always random moments of boredom. Sometimes it's right when you're about to concentrate deeply, when you're about to do something meaningful, when you're stepping into a version of yourself that requires discipline. That's when your brain starts offering alternatives. Quick pleasure, easy distraction, immediate relief. Not because your mind is against you, but because it's wired to conserve effort and seek comfort. Deep work, growth, change, they all require energy. So your brain tries to redirect you to something easier. And desire becomes one of the most powerful tools for that redirection. Once you see that pattern clearly, it becomes less personal. It's not, why am I like this? It becomes, this is how my system tries to avoid discomfort. And that shift removes a lot of the frustration, replacing judgment with curiosity. One of the most effective changes you can make isn't about controlling behavior. It's about changing how you respond internally. Most people respond with judgment. They feel something and immediately label it as bad, weak, or something to be ashamed of. That reaction creates internal conflict. And internal conflict drains energy faster than the urge itself. But curiosity does something different. When you get curious, you start asking, what triggered this? What was I doing right before this feeling came up? Am I tired, stressed, or avoiding something? Now, instead of fighting yourself, you're learning about yourself. And that learning builds awareness. The more aware you become, the less automatic your reactions are. The role of environment. A lot of people underestimate how much their environment shapes their behavior. Not just physical environment, but digital, social, and mental environments. If your surroundings constantly stimulate you, constantly push your attention toward quick hits of pleasure, your baseline changes. Your brain starts expecting constant stimulation. So when things get quiet, your mind searches for something intense. That's when urges can feel stronger. Not because you're weaker, but because your environment trained your attention that way. Even small changes in your environment can shift this. Reducing unnecessary noise, creating spaces where your mind can settle, being more intentional about what you consume. These changes don't eliminate desire, but they reduce the intensity of the constant triggers. And that makes everything easier to manage. Learning to sit with discomfort. There's a skill that doesn't get enough attention, but it changes everything once you develop it. The ability to sit with discomfort without immediately escaping it. This doesn't just apply to desire. It applies to stress, boredom, uncertainty, even emotional pain. Most people are trained, without realizing it, to escape discomfort as quickly as possible. Scroll, eat, distract, react. But every time you escape instantly, you reinforce the habit of avoidance. And avoidance keeps patterns strong. When you sit with discomfort, even for a short time, you're doing something different. You're showing your mind that the feeling isn't dangerous, that it can exist without controlling you. At first, it feels difficult, but over time it becomes easier. And eventually it becomes normal when control turns into balance. There's a difference between control and balance. Control often comes from tension. It feels like you're constantly holding something back, constantly resisting. And that kind of control is hard to maintain long-term. Balance feels different. It's not about suppressing everything. It's about understanding when to engage and when to step back. It's flexible, sustainable, and most importantly, it doesn't create constant internal pressure. When you move toward balance, you stop seeing yourself as someone who is fighting your own nature. You start seeing yourself as someone who is learning how to work with it. And that mindset is much more stable over time. The identity you quietly build. Every decision you make, especially the small ones, adds up. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, steady way. Each time you pause instead of reacting instantly, you reinforce a new pattern. Each time you choose awareness over impulse, you strengthen a different version of yourself. And over time, that version becomes more natural. You don't have to force it as much. It becomes how you operate. Not because you're trying to be someone else, but because you've practiced being more aware. And that awareness becomes part of your identity. You're not starting from zero. It's easy to feel like you're behind, like you should have figured everything out already. But that perspective ignores something important. You've already started. The fact that you're noticing patterns, the fact that you're questioning them, the fact that you're trying to understand instead of just reacting. That's not the beginning. That's progress. And progress isn't always visible from the outside. But internally, it changes everything. A different way to measure growth. Most people measure growth in extremes. Complete discipline, no mistakes, total control. But that's not how real growth usually looks. A more accurate way to measure it is this. Are you reacting less automatically than before? Are you becoming more aware of your patterns? Are you giving yourself more space before acting? If the answer is yes, even slightly, that's growth. And those small shifts, repeated over time, create real change. The quiet confidence that follows. As you continue to understand yourself more deeply, something begins to settle. You don't feel as chaotic internally. You don't feel like you're constantly being pulled in different directions. There's a steadiness that starts to form. Not perfection, not complete control, but stability. And that stability creates a kind of confidence that isn't loud. It doesn't need validation. It comes from knowing that you can handle your own patterns, that you're not completely at the mercy of your impulses. And that confidence changes how you move through everything else in life. At the end of all this, nothing about you is broken. There's no need to label yourself negatively for experiencing something that is deeply human. What matters is how you understand it, how you respond to it, and how you grow through it. Because the same energy that feels overwhelming at times can become something steady, focused, and directed over time. Not by force, but through awareness. So instead of asking yourself how to eliminate it completely, a more useful question might be, how can I understand this better so it stops controlling me? And if you've ever noticed this pattern in your own life, especially during moments when you were trying to grow or change, it's worth reflecting on what you saw in yourself during those times. Not to judge it, but to understand it a little more clearly. If this connected with you on a real level, don't just move on like it's another video. Take a second and actually think about what you've been experiencing lately, the patterns, the moments, the shifts. Because awareness only matters if you use it. And if you're on this path of understanding yourself more deeply, then stay close to this space. There's more to explore, more to understand, and more growth ahead. Share your experience below, what you've noticed, what's been challenging, or what's been changing for you. Sometimes the most powerful step forward starts with being honest about where you are right now. And if you want more content like this that actually makes you think, not just feel, then make sure you're here for the next one.